Welcome to Revenge with Luna. My name is Clara Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old. And if you think the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are incapable of destroying you completely, let me be the one to correct that assumption. 7 years ago, my sister looked me dead in the eyes across our parents' kitchen table and said 4 words that I have never forgotten. "You are dead weight." Her husband nodded behind her like she'd just delivered a sermon. And my parents, the 2 people who held my hands when I learned to walk, who sang to me when I was sick, sat at the heads of that table and said absolutely nothing. Not one word. The silence was louder than anything she could have screamed. I left that house with a single duffel bag, a checking account they had already convinced me to drain for my sister's emergency, and a bruise on my chest that no one would ever be able to see. 7 years. No calls on my birthday. No texts at Christmas. No apologies in the mail. I was erased, folded up like a piece of paper that had outlived its usefulness and tucked somewhere no one would ever look. But here's the thing about being erased. You stop being afraid of blank pages. You start filling them yourself. I want you to understand what they took from me before I tell you what I built. Because the story only means something if you feel the weight of what I was carrying when I started. When I was 24, our grandmother passed away and left us each an inheritance. Mine was $47,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a foundation. My sister came to me 3 months after the funeral with swollen eyes and a story about her husband's business collapsing. Medical bills, debt collectors calling at midnight. She needed $30,000 and she promised, on our grandmother's memory, that she would pay it back within a year. I handed over the money the same week. I didn't even ask for a written agreement. Because she was my sister. People don't draw up contracts with their own blood. She never paid back a single dollar. And within 6 months, her husband's collapsed business had somehow reopened with a fresh coat of paint and new inventory. I found out later that my $30,000 was the seed money. I wasn't a lender. I was a donor who hadn't been told the terms. When I brought it up at that kitchen table, I wasn't asking for a fight. I was asking for an explanation. What I got instead was my sister calling me jealous, her husband calling me a financial burden to the entire family, and my parents suggesting, gently, that I needed to let it go for the sake of family harmony. When I refused to let it go, the vote was unanimous. I was the problem. I was asked to leave, so I left, and I didn't look back. Not once. I moved to a city where no one knew my last name. I slept on an air mattress in a studio apartment for 4 months and worked 2 jobs while I finished my architecture licensure exam. I designed commercial spaces on my laptop at 2 a.m. After 10-hour shifts, I cried exactly once, in the shower, on what would have been my grandmother's birthday, and then I stopped crying and kept working. I built something they couldn't have imagined. A firm with 18 employees, contracts with 3 of the fastest-growing hospitality brands in the country, and a reputation for design work that had been featured in 2 national publications. I bought a penthouse in the same city where my sister and her husband still lived their comfortable, dishonest life. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a private terrace, a view of the skyline that reminded me every single morning that I had built every inch of it myself. I was not waiting for them. I was not plotting. I was living. And that, more than anything else I could have done, turned out to be the most devastating thing of all. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in a client meeting when I felt my phone buzz with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it buzzed again. And again. I stepped out into the hallway and listened to the message. It was my mother. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, smaller. "Clara, it's Mom. I know you probably won't call back. But sweetheart, things have gotten very bad. Your sister and David are in trouble. Real trouble this time. We didn't know who else to call. Please, we just need to talk." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. The old instinct was still there, buried deep but alive. The reflex to drop everything and fix things for people who had never once fixed anything for me. I recognized it for exactly what it was, a habit. A very old, very dangerous habit. I did not call back that day, but I did something else. I called my attorney. Because here's what they didn't know. For 7 years, I had been quietly assembling something. Every document my sister had ever signed with my name as a reference. Bank statements from the weeks surrounding the loan. Text messages I'd screenshotted and backed up to 3 separate cloud accounts. Emails. I even had a voicemail, saved from year 2, where my sister called to say she hadn't forgotten about the money and would work something out soon. An admission in her own voice. I hadn't built a grudge. I had built a case. My attorney had already reviewed everything 18 months prior, when I first began to think clearly enough about the past to look at it without flinching. She told me I had grounds for civil action. I had simply been waiting for the right moment, not out of cruelty, out of precision. I called my mother back the following morning. She answered on the first ring, which told me everything about how desperate things had become. She said my name like a prayer. I let her talk. The story came out in pieces. David's second business had failed. Not just failed, collapsed under a federal investigation for financial fraud. Their joint assets were frozen pending review. The house they'd lived in for 6 years was facing foreclosure. They had burned through their savings, borrowed from friends who were no longer speaking to them, and were now looking at the very real possibility of having nowhere to live within 60 days. My mother's voice cracked when she said the next part. Your sister asked if maybe, just for a little while, you might have a spare room. I let the silence sit between us for a long moment. Then I said quietly and clearly, I don't have a spare room, but I do have something else to offer. Tell her to call me directly. My sister called that same evening. Her voice had changed. The sharpness was gone. What was left sounded like someone who had practiced being humble without quite mastering it yet. She said she was sorry. She said she'd thought about what happened at the table many times over the years. She said she knew the money was wrong and that she'd always intended to make it right. The words were technically correct, but they landed without weight, like furniture that had been hollowed out from the inside. I told her I was glad she called. I told her I'd been thinking as well. I told her there might be a path forward, but I needed her and David to come to my home so we could discuss things face to face, the way family should. She agreed before I even finished the sentence. I told my attorney to be ready. When they arrived the following Saturday, I watched them from the terrace before buzzing them up. My sister looked like a version of herself with the volume turned all the way down. Her husband walked 2 steps behind her, which was new. They were dressed carefully, as if they had rehearsed, looking like they weren't desperate. It almost worked. I met them at the elevator. I shook their hands. I offered them coffee. I was gracious and warm and completely unreadable, and I could see in my sister's eyes that this unsettled her more than anger would have. We sat in my living room with the city spread out below us, and my sister began the conversation she had clearly rehearsed. She spoke about family, about mistakes and growth and the importance of not letting pride destroy relationships. She talked about my grandmother and how she would have wanted us to reconcile. She mentioned the $30,000 twice, obliquely, in ways that seemed designed to acknowledge it without fully owning it. I waited until she was finished. I set my coffee cup down. Then I placed a folder on the table between us. Inside was a civil demand letter, prepared by my attorney, citing the original loan, the accumulated interest over 7 years, documentation of the misrepresentation involved in obtaining the funds, and a formal request for repayment totaling just over $61,000. Behind it was a secondary document, a detailed account of the events leading to my removal from the family, with specific reference to the statements made by both my sister and her husband, documented to the extent possible, and a formal notice that I intended to provide a full accounting of these events to anyone who asked, including the journalists who had already begun covering David's federal case. My sister's face went through 5 different expressions in about 4 seconds. David started to speak. I held up one hand. I said, I didn't bring you here to argue. I brought you here because I believe in giving people the opportunity to make things right before the world finds out they didn't. You have until the end of this week to respond to that letter through proper legal channels. That's the only offer on the table." My sister's voice went sharp again, briefly, the old reflex. "You'd really do this to your own family?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "You did it first." They left without finishing their coffee. I stood on my terrace and watched the city below me and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, just steadiness. The kind that comes from finally telling the truth out loud. What happened next moved faster than I had anticipated. By Monday, David's attorney had contacted mine. By Tuesday, my sister had called 3 times, each message escalating from pleading to accusatory and back again. By Wednesday, I received a call from a reporter at a regional business publication who had been covering the federal investigation into David's firm. Someone had mentioned my name in connection with the original seed money. The reporter wanted my side of things. I gave it to her, calmly, factually, with documentation. I didn't perform grief or anger. I simply told the truth in the same measured way I had learned to tell it to myself over 7 years. The money, the kitchen table, the silence, the duffel bag, the air mattress, the exam at 2 a.m. I told all of it. The article ran on Friday. By that weekend, my parents had called. My mother was crying in a way that didn't sound practiced. My father, who had not spoken to me in 7 years, who I had not heard cry once in my entire childhood, was crying too. Real crying, the kind that doesn't have an audience. He said, "We failed you. There is no other word for what we did. We chose the easy thing instead of the right thing, and we have been paying for that choice every single day, even when we pretended we weren't." I listened. I did not tell him it was fine. I did not tell him I forgave everything instantly and completely, because that would have been a performance, not the truth. I told him I heard him. I told him that meant something. I told him that whatever came next would take time, and that time was the only honest currency between us now. It was more than I had given my sister, and less than they might have hoped for. It was exactly what was real. The civil case settled 3 months later, not for the full amount, because David's assets were largely frozen and would remain so pending the federal outcome, but for enough to represent acknowledgement, enough to have documentation that the debt had existed and been formally addressed. My attorney called it a strong result, given the circumstances. I called it a closed door. My sister moved in with my parents temporarily while things were sorted out. I did not offer my penthouse. I did not feel guilty for not offering it. Those 2 facts, existing cleanly alongside each other without contradiction, felt like the clearest sign that I had actually healed something. I want to tell you what I did with what I recovered, because the money was never really the point. The point was what the money represented. My grandmother's belief in me, the foundation she wanted me to have. The proof that I had been worth investing in, even when my own family had decided otherwise. I used part of it to fund a mentorship program for young women in my field who are doing what I did at 24. Working 2 jobs, sleeping on air mattresses, taking licensing exams at 2 a.m. I know what it feels like to do all of that without anyone in your corner, and I have been that corner for 7 of them now. 3 have launched their own firms. 1 just won a regional design award. I cried at her reception in a way I didn't cry once during the entire legal process. The rest I put back into my firm. We hired 2 new associates. We landed a contract that will carry us through the next 3 years. The work is good. The team is good. The view from my terrace is still the same. Some nights I stand out there in the quiet, and I think about that kitchen table. I think about the way my parents' silence felt like a physical thing, heavy and solid, pressing down on me from across the room. I think about my sister's 4 words and the way her husband nodded. I think about the duffel bag and the $17,000 that remained in my account, and how I rationed it across 4 months like a person who understood for the first time that no one was going to catch her if she fell. I do not think about these things with bitterness anymore. I think about them the way you think about a course you took in school that was brutally hard and that you almost failed and that turned out to be the class that changed everything. You don't love the difficulty, but you stop being ashamed that it was difficult. My father called me last month to tell me my sister had started seeing a therapist. He said it the way people say things when they are hoping the information will serve as a bridge. I thanked him for telling me. I meant it. I hope it helps her. I genuinely do. Not because I owe her my goodwill, but because holding on to the opposite of goodwill is a weight I already put down and have no interest in picking back up. My relationship with my parents is slow and careful and real in a way it never was before, because we are both aware now that it is a choice rather than an assumption. We have dinner on the first Sunday of every month. We talk about small things. We are learning, gradually, what it means to know each other without the performance of family that used to stand in the way of the actual people underneath. It is not a fairy tale reconciliation. It is something more durable than that. I was talking to one of my mentees last week, a 6-year-old, who had just been passed over for a promotion she'd earned by a colleague whose father sat on the company board. She was furious in the specific way you are furious when injustice is happening in real time and you can't stop it and you don't know yet that you will survive it. She asked me what I did when I felt like that, when I felt like the world had arranged itself specifically to keep me from what I deserved. I told her the truth. I told her I worked. I told her I documented everything. I told her I got a very good attorney. I told her I stopped performing okayness for people who were not okay. And I started being honest about what had happened to me and what I intended to do about it. I told her that the anger was real and valid, and also that if she fed it like a fire, it would eventually burn things she didn't intend to burn, including herself. I told her to let it be fuel, not a destination. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Did it work?" I looked out at the skyline from my office window, the city I had moved to with nothing, the city that didn't know my last name until I made it worth knowing. I said, "I'm still here, aren't I?" She smiled. The kind of smile that has something solid behind it. I am still here. That is the whole story, and also the only part of it that matters. They called me dead weight. They voted me out of the room. They handed me a duffel bag and the understanding that I was not worth fighting for. And they went back to their comfortable arrangements and their willful blindness and their kitchen table that had one less person at it. And I built something from the ground up, with nobody's help and nobody's permission, in a city that did not owe me anything at hours of the night when most people were asleep. I filed the paperwork. I passed the exam. I hired the first employee, and then the second, and then the 18th. I stood in boardrooms and conference rooms and on construction sites in hard hats. And I was good at it. Genuinely, seriously good. Not because someone handed me the tools, but because I had learned in the hardest possible way that the only opinion of my capabilities that I was required to carry was my own. The gate they tried to close on me turned out to be a door they were never supposed to be holding in the first place. I closed it myself on my way out, and from the other side, I built everything. Welcome to Revenge with Luna. My name is Clara Mitchell, and this is what it looks like when the dead weight learns to fly.